Dr. Paul, coming up next, we're going to be hearing from Beryl D'Souza, the National Director of Good Shepherd Healthcare Initiative. She's a new name, maybe, to some of the attendees that have been around. What can you tell us about Dr.
Well, I know that Dr. Beryl is highly recommended from Andrew Scott, and I have watched this next talk, and this is an amazing lady who's doing an amazing work, and she is, the talk she's going to give in just now, it will challenge you, it will encourage you, and she has great insight, and so I think you're going to be blessed by Beryl, and I hope that this is not her last time to speak at M3.
She's making an incredible difference in India. Let's take a listen now.
So happy to be here with you amazing folks at M3. So grateful for Dr. Paul and his amazing team, of whom I've met some people. What an inspiration to have this conference which mobilizes people to moving into missions. When I was a little girl, about the age of 8, I was in church and I heard a speaker speak that there are 2 kinds of dreams you can dream. There's your own dream, which will be great, it'll be exciting, it'll be good. And then there's God's dream, which may not be your plans completely, may not have always your best interests or apparent best interest, but be way, way bigger than you can ever imagine. And then he left us with a question: what dream would you like to dream? Would it be, what's the question for you? And so that made an impact in my head about the dreams we dream. Now, I would like to share my story. I grew up in a safe Christian home. Both my parents worked with a mission, and we had what was known as a mission subculture bubble, where you live in this cushioned, safe environment that protects you from the outside world, both the challenges and the things that are outside that may not be right, so that you're living a happy, peaceful life. The bubble person. And so that was my life, and I found faith very easy and early in life. And very quickly, I also decided I didn't really like Christians. I said I loved God, but I didn't really like missions, and the church and organized religion was not for me, because as a young teenager, I had been able to see the hypocrisy, the double standards, and the fallenness of people around me, and obviously not be aware of my own fallenness. And so that was where I was at. And so I finished school, I graduated, I went to medical school, and I found myself working in a tiny little hospital in northern Karnataka. And in this hospital, very suddenly, I was exposed to a large group of young women, almost around the same age that I was at that time, who were all victims of HIV and AIDS, sexually transmitted illnesses. And it began me questioning as to why such a large group of young women, most of them single women, were suffering with this problem. And then after digging deeper, discovering that they were actually victims of ritualized sex slavery. And then being completely horrified that such a problem actually still existed, because in my textbooks, they were an age-old practice that was no longer present. But seeing these young women all suffering with the illnesses, very often brought to our hospital to die peacefully, was a very shocking experience. It completely rocked my world, made me question my identity, made me question God and his plan for all of this. How could this be fair? It was at a time where antiretroviral therapy was not available easily across India. And so for those women, we could not get the required drugs. And so just treating their illnesses and then watching them slowly get worse and sicker and then die was an inevitability. And in those years, I began to form relationships with these women, and making me think about how fair or just the world was, and what if The places were reversed. It made me question my own caste. I was a child of an intercaste marriage. In India, we pretend that the caste system doesn't really exist and that it's an age-old practice, but it seems to be very, very prevalent in our thinking. It seems to be very prevalent in politics. It clearly identifies whether you are going to be a victim of various forms of exploitation, because most of these women who were my patients there were all members of the lower caste, the marginalized caste. And for me, understanding that my parents, who were of a mixed caste marriage, my father was from a South Indian upper caste Christian family, my mother was from a tribal family, I was also considered to be mixed or outcast. And what if it had been me, and if I had been lying in the bed with HIV and dying alone with nobody there? How fair would that have been for me? And just challenging me to think that I had all these privileges because God had put me where I was, and that those privileges came with a responsibility, and that I could either go on my little bubble or get involved with the mess that was around me, and realizing that this was going to be my mountain, that the system of inequality, of sexual exploitation, and its various consequences in health, on education, and all of that, which was a vicious cycle that continued for centuries, had to be something that I had to do my part for. And so I joined the Good Shepherd OM group of ministries, which had just begun its movement into social justice. And we began our journey looking at various facets of community transformation, of which education became a strong, important factor. And the Good Shepherd OM group of ministries in the last 20 years has been able to build and develop about 100 schools, currently teaching about 26,000 children in the schools. And in the schools, not only are these kids being given English medium education, they're also given teaching in a worldview which says that you are made in the image of God, that you can dream dreams, any dreams you would like to dream, and that nothing is impossible if you work as hard as possible. Things like that, which actually breaks you out of a cycle of abuse, poverty, and exploitation. And then Good Shepherd Health, which is what I'm part of, which recognized the strong link between a health crisis and trafficking. More than 90% of India pay out of pocket for their healthcare expenses. And so if you have money, you can get the best in healthcare. If you don't have money, you start thinking, what do I sell? And if you have assets, you sell your land, you sell your cattle. If you don't have assets, then you start selling your family. That again happens regularly, where the family is in a desperate situation, especially in rural India, and there are entry points into the sex slavery system. There's a well-organized trafficking industry in India, which is, I think, the largest in numbers. I think about 18 million people are involved in that. And so kids get sold off, and communities condone it because they're in such abject poverty that this is the only life available to them. And so Good Shepherd Health then decided that the best way to tackle that would be then by providing community health workers, who would be women and men who lived in the community and were able to promote health teachings, and provide an access into a non-exploitative good medicine. That was the key factor, where you get medicine, you don't have to be exploited. There are systems available, there are the clinics, the right people to protect the communities that are most vulnerable from exploitation. And so in the last decade, we've had about over 100 health workers trained, currently about 150 workers in place, about 4 clinics and about 20 virtual health centers working across the area, but more so in areas of trafficking, protecting and preventing people from various forms of health exploitation, especially sexual exploitation. And along with that, working with communities that are at high risk of trafficking, and by empowering women to be leaders in their community, who are educated alongside with us and the government forces to become vigilantes in their villages to protect other women and girls from being exploited. One story of a girl that I'd like to share. Her name is Bhimama. Bhimama came to us a few years ago when she was just about 18. She hadn't yet turned 18. The health worker had referred her from a rural village. and she came with a hemoglobin of 5 grams, which is ridiculously low for a woman in final trimester of her pregnancy. She was just about a few weeks or 2 weeks away from her due date. Mama explained to us that this was her third pregnancy. She had lost the first two. The first was stillborn, the second, some brutal accident, and she lost it, and she really wanted this child. She also explained to us her story, which was that she was made a sex worker at the age of 10. Her grandmother was a ritualized sex worker. Her mother was married young and her father had died. So her mother thought the best thing she could do to make ends meet was to sell her daughter into sexual slavery to provide for the rest of the family. There were other siblings. Bimama would explain to us the first day that her mother married her off to this man, which was a ceremony where he pays her, the mother, a sum of money for the sexual favor. And her mother being in the next room while she's being abused and raped by this man, and describing to us her complete devastation that her own mother, who was supposed to be her protector, the person who took care of her and cherished her, allowed her to be raped while being in the next room. And when meeting her the next day, saying, "This is your destiny, this is what you're born for," making her feel that there was no point in living. In order to comply with her now practice of sexual favors or sex working practices, her mother then provided her with local alcohol, which she began to get addicted to by the age of 12, 13, 14, and became a part of her life. And so when she came to our clinic, she was able to get the blood transfusions, have a safe delivery, have this beautiful baby boy born. And then within 24 hours, the whole clinic realizing that both mother and child were not well because they both were suffering from withdrawal seizures due to lack of alcohol. And understanding again the reality of life for young girls in rural parts of the country where sexual exploitation is a reality, where forced alcoholism is a reality. And then working with her and the child in detoxifying them, bringing them up to a stage where they were both healthy and ready for discharge, where the mother and baby had bonded well, and then sending them back into their village, but with the security of a health worker supervising them, a social worker helping them tap into having government support for nutritional needs, and then later on watching the baby and the mother thrive. A year after her baby was born, Bimama was moved into a vocational training program where she learned a tailoring skill to set up her own enterprise. And 2 years later, Bimama has joined our program as a peer worker where she herself is an advocate for other young women and girls like herself. In the last 1 year, the COVID year of 2020, she was actually able to rescue and refer 20 young girls like herself. She's become a leader in her community, and stories like hers, though heart-wrenching to begin with, give us so much of inspiration and hope that everything is possible with our God, and that our people are made with such immense potential. Each one of us, men and women, made in the image of God, if just given the right amount of identity, the right amount of resources, we can do so much. Imagine what the world would be like. And so Bimama's story is really exciting. Along with her story are many others of women who have stood up against the slavery systems in this country and become leaders. We've had stories about women undergoing violence and then fighting back because they felt empowered enough to do that. And that again gives us a lot of hope when we're in a country where violence against women is really increasing. In the last 1 year, I think India's really making headlines with the amount of gang rapes that's happening. Now, mind you all, I love being an Indian. India is a great country, and though I share all these awful stories, I would not be anywhere else but in India. Whenever I get the opportunity to travel to the West, I enjoy it for approximately 2 weeks. I love the weather. I enjoy the food for some time. And then exactly 2 weeks, 14 or 15 days, it'll be like, now, where are the people? What's wrong with when is the sun going to come out? Why is there no color? And really, they say if you haven't visited India, you really have not seen the world, because India is so full of culture, beauty, warmth, the hospitality, the food. There's so many great things about India, which makes it a fascinating country. And yet, we have a prevailing social injustice system a system that says people are unequal. Nothing was more evident during the COVID pandemic, which hit, of course, the entire world, but also India. And if you were watching media at that time, you would have seen what happened to be the migrant crisis, where you got to see over 200 million people walk by foot back to their homes because of a immediate urgent lockdown which happened overnight. So within hours, the people who did most of India's physical work, so the people who worked in factories, the domestic workers, the cleaners, the people who serve society, so to speak, were rendered homeless and unemployed because of a lockdown. They say that crises reveal a person's true character. I only got to learn that after I got married. You can see who you are in a crisis. You can get to see your best and your worst in a crisis. And it's the same in society, it's the same in countries. You can see a country's true culture, a true identity in a crisis. And what the pandemic crisis did is reveal the identities of people around the world. And I will not comment on that because I'm sure there are lots of issues out there. Everybody has strong views on that. But I can share what happened in India, which was just a demonstration which has been talked about in the past, but vividly seen about the two Indias, where one India was fortunate indeed to have the lockdown and to stay safe and stay home. And the other India that was left on the streets, unemployed, hungry, at risk of violence and abuse. The pictures that came of people walking thousands and thousands of kilometers on foot and dying, heat-related illnesses, all of that. And one picture that stuck in my mind for months later has been of a young woman and her baby. The young woman is lying dead on the platform, and her 2-year-old son is playing with her shroud. There were lots of deaths last year. I think 2020, has been the hardest year for most of us around the world living, unless you're 100 years, and then we're in the previous pandemic. This has been the hardest year. But I think we didn't have to have as many casualties as we did because of the injustices we had in our society, where needless deaths happened. There are deaths that you can prevent. A pandemic happens once in 100 years, and that's very hard to prevent. But why do you have to prevent? Why can we not prevent injustices such as this, where a 2-year-old has to lose her mother or his mother because of a fallen, broken down system? And so that has been the mountain that me and my team have been trying to fight in our lifetime, and believe that it is still possible. The world is hard and there are lots of injustices around our world, but we do believe we have a God of justice, cares. In my work with community health and sexual slavery, preventing sexual slavery, I've been able to reread the Bible with a different lens. And one that has really impacted me last year has been the story of Hagar. We all know the story of Abraham and Sarah. They are the father and mother of our faith, so to speak. And we all know that Hagar was basically the result of it being really hard to wait on God for fulfilling his promises. Nobody would blame them. God promised you would be the father of a nation, and yet at 90, you've not had a child. How is that possible? No one would blame them. And so they used Hagar, who was, culturally, it was a common practice for people to have slaves. And culturally, it was a common practice for women to give their slaves to their husband to have children from them. And so she was nothing but a sex slave. And when she got pregnant and began to scorn her mistress, Sarah obviously got angry and wanted to get her out of the picture. And Abraham, instead of protecting this woman who was bearing his child, said, do whatever you wish. And so they sent her away into the wilderness. And there in the wilderness, our God is revealed to her as the God who sees and the God who hears. For the first time, to a sex slave. For me, that has been so phenomenal to completely appreciate. How God reveals himself for the first time in all the other characters in the Bible to this woman who was not even in the big picture, Abraham and Sarah are the chosen one. They are the promised people. And here is Hagar. She's just, by the way, coming to the picture and is obviously abused and exploited, now left away by herself. And he reveals himself for the first time to her as the God who sees and the God who hears. That gives me so much of hope about how awesome our God is. What a God of justice. I have children that I take to the park often, much more before the pandemic, and very often kids get into fight, and when they get into fights, I look away, I pretend not to get involved. Most often it's my boys causing the trouble, but I don't get involved. It's like, let them sort them out, and if at all I have to get involved, I do tend to take my children's side. But this is not true of our God. Our God is not a God of favoritism. He's a God of justice. He saw Hagar in her plight, and he reveals himself as a God who sees everything that's happening around the world, all the injustices, all the exploitations, all the impossible solutions, and he brings in his justice. And he uses men and women like you and me to do that. And that is the most awesome thing, where we can imagine a world free of all these evils, of all these exploitative systems because of him, not on our own. As he said to Zerubbabel, as the word of the Lord appeared to Zerubbabel in the scriptures, it's not by might, not by power, but by my spirit that these mountains shall be removed. And that's what we believe for our country. Such a beautiful country called India, with amazing things to offer, and yet mountains that have to go, which do not fit into what God's plan is of a broken world. And so, dear friends, I really would like to encourage you to think about your future and to think about your dreams, to think about, would you like to dream your own dream, or would you like to dream the mountains to move? How exciting would that be? So be encouraged, take thought about it, and move in that direction. Thank you so much.
Inspiring and encouraging talk from Dr. D'Souza today, and we are happy that she is willing to join us live for some Q&A. If you have a question or a comment, just click on the little tab right there on the website and you can ask away, and we'll do our best to get you. But Dr. D'Souza, good to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Jim.
Hey, how are you? There seems to be a theme going on when you mention two kinds of dreams, mine or God's dream. I've heard several people say that, and just how much better it is when we let God direct our path, when we go after His dream rather than our own. But privilege comes with responsibility. I also heard you say that. Would you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So again, following God's dream is a great privilege. And there are exciting things that happen in our life when we do that. And at the same time, the responsibility of the impact that we have and the path we choose can be tremendous. Currently, the country that I serve in is a country where there are various challenges to practicing human rights, including our own democracy. So things like that make life sometimes seeming to be more dangerous. At the same time, realizing that our God is sovereign and protecting us as we follow in with His plan.
I love that. You said you have to get involved in the mess around you, that you've been willing to get involved in the mess around you. I really admire that about you. And we serve a God of justice. That's what I hear you saying, that He cares. And so the things that break His heart should be the things that break our heart. And we love that you're serving there with the least of these.
Beryl, thanks so much. I enjoyed your talk so much. And it's good to meet you virtually. So. I love the fact that you are addressing trafficking from a totally different perspective, and I know you said this in your talk, but maybe you could just comment a little bit more on it. The fact that healthcare often, the lack of healthcare or the lack of the resources to pay for healthcare are often driving forces that deplete a family and cause them to have to. Unfortunately, what they choose to do is sell off their loved ones. Talk just a little bit more about that.
Yes, so very few health professionals around the world realize how deeply linked the lack of a health, of a universal healthcare system and the lack of the resources to pay for healthcare leads to various forms of exploitation, including sexual slavery. For me, that was a real eye opener as a young doctor, realizing how unfair the world was in India and understanding that it is a reality. So, what happens in India, more than 70% of people will pay out of pocket for their healthcare expenses. And so if you have assets, you sell your assets. If you have land, you can sell land. If you have cattle, you sell cattle. If you don't have either of those, and you have your wife or your husband who is, the main breadwinner, and you need to pay for his expenses, and selling your children or selling your wife is a reality. Just today, there was this news about a 3-year-old child dying with a surgical condition outside a hospital, and that the hospital people didn't really intervene in something that was obviously treatable. So it just in broad daylight, and the news and media picked on it, and it again just makes those of us who are involved in more equitable healthcare really angry that this can't be happening.
Yeah.
It's one thing if you die, bad COVID, which we're still trying to figure out, or cancer, but a child shouldn't die like that outside a hospital.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes no sense. But
Yeah.
that is the reality that in India, if you have the money, the assets to pay, you get the best, and if you don't, then your life is expensible.
Beryl, you mentioned too, one of the most profound parts of your talk, where you mentioned that the first time God reveals himself as the God who sees and the God who hears is to an exploited woman. You see that every day.
And so I find that really encouraging. So after the work that I've been involved in, rereading the scripture and seeing how God reveals himself in suffering, and especially to broken women. So it's really inspiring and encouraging to me when I sometimes see so much of brokenness. It feels like we're just making tiny steps forward. And will it really change? I mean, the world has been messed up for centuries, and there are challenges in our country for centuries. Will it really change? And then realizing that there's a God who's been there all along and is working, and using people like you and me and others who have talked in this meeting and others around the world to be his hands and feet and to come alongside him and do great things. He uses us. He can just solve all the problems of injustice, trafficking, the health injustices, and all of that on his own. But he chooses to use us. And that is encouraging and inspiring, a life worth living.
And Beryl, if he's a God who sees and hears places of injustice, we should, and people involved in it, we should do the same thing. We should see them and we should hear them. So we applaud you in what you're doing, and we wish you the best, and thank you so much for taking your time. Chuck, any questions?
Yeah, in fact, we have a couple of them. One of them is from Jonathan and says, for a doctor wanting to work in helping prevent and address the most prevalent social injustices in India, what area of medicine do you think is the most helpful?
In India, I think anything that would be more broader specialties. If you want to work in community medicine or general practice, pediatrics, OBG, those are the simpler specialties which make you more available and accessible to people in the communities. Surgical specialties also have great demand, but then you're confined to working within a hospital. So
yeah.
I wouldn't worry so much about the specialty as much as the interest you have to serve. So I think God doesn't make you give up your desires and dreams just to serve, and He can use both. So
yeah, that was a good question. And Jonathan is joining us from India for the M3 conference this weekend. Another question. This comes from Ping in California. How do you, Dr. D'Souza, how do you not get weighed down with all of what you deal with on an everyday basis?
Well, I think it's, again, God's Spirit that encourages us, and then the church and the community of believers who support us. You can get bowed down by, all the things that are going wrong, or just hearing one sad story after another story. But again, we talked about the scripture that of God revealing Himself and revealing Himself through these problems of immense suffering, immense distress, that there is light in darkness. Just recently, someone told me this term, which really struck me, was illuminescence in darkness.
And that's what we're seeing in the suffering and struggles and the injustices that we see, that God is there. In fact, God is there even more powerful, if you know what I mean.
Beautiful.
That's great insight. Well, Dr. Souza, thank you so much for joining us. You're officially part of the M3 family now, so we're so excited to have you. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time today.
Okay. Thank you.